So this week, massive news coming out of the USA. We're doing an emergency pod and we've got our first special guest joining me this week to go through it. If you haven't seen what's happening, we're going to talk about what is the significance of descheduling cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. To be mindful, this isn't just applicable to the USA. If we're looking at the impact that the USA and worldwide regulation will have in terms of countries like the UK, Australia, and how this will affect the United Nations as a whole, stay tuned and let's get into it. What I want to do today is I want to introduce our special guest. Our special guest who is joining us today is Chris Murray. If you're not familiar with Chris Murray, check him out online. Every time something comes up around cannabis scheduling, he's up on LinkedIn and everyone goes to him as the source. And that is with good reason. And if you don't know, he is a regulatory strategist and industry expert across several market sectors, including cannabis. He is a council member at Rolling Stone Culture Council. He's the principal strategist at FoxNrth. He's a regular speaker across all the best conferences around the world. And more recently, he was on a webinar with one of the representatives from the FDA talking about this very issue. So let's get over to Chris and I drilling into this right now. So, man, I've been online quite a lot, and every time when something comes up about cannabis, I go to you. You're the first person I go to, and yesterday you were active. Of course, you're active for good reason, and there's a lot going on. So I thought, if I'm listening to you and I have a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of other people that want to hear from you as well. So I'm glad you came on to join us. Give us a little bit about yourself first and foremost. I know we gave an intro, and then what the hell is happening at the moment, man?
Sounds good. Yeah. So Chris Murray, I've been working in the cannabis industry for a decade now, and I was part of the team that started Canopy Growth, originally Tweed in 2013, and have been working in cannabis globally since then. And so in 2020, I left Canopy, started a consultancy, and kind of pulled some of the best moves and some of the best people that I could into the group in terms of what we're doing. We really focus primarily on the cannabis industry internationally, as well as kind of really with a focus on the interface with the health system. So what we're seeing in terms of the changes, announcements the last 24 hours, 48 hours is really consistent with what we were anticipating. And so there's a lot of opportunity that kind of will present itself to jump off the back of this. But yeah, so I run a consultancy called FoxNrth with a group of people, and we support businesses really working in the international cannabis sector, not really in Canada, even though that's where we're based.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I'm sure at the end of this, we'll provide some links and where people can follow up with you, because I'm sure after they hear you talk and how you're going to unpack this, there's going to be some more questions. But to start, I'm going to present a little bit of a timeline here that dates back to, say, 2015. And so if you can just talk over a little bit about what is happening at the moment and what is the main significance from cannabis being a Schedule 1 to the recommendation, and if you can go into that slightly as well with the HHS, how they've now recommended that it goes to a Schedule 3. What's your take?
So generally speaking, so if you understand the timeline of cannabis within the United States, you know that there's been a history of kind of petitions to reschedule or deschedule cannabis. This is not something new. President Obama rejected one of those in 2015. They rejected again 2016, but the 2016 one came with a very specific little paragraph that said it was an acknowledgement that we are rejecting this, but we also need to make this product available for research so that we can determine whether it is or is not a medical substance. And so they added this really as a single paragraph in their response that said that they would be accepting applicants for new bulk manufacturing. And so that goes 2016. Now, what happened was we had 2016, there was a change in the administration in the United States. There was changes at the Justice Department, and ultimately, because it's a controlled substance, the Justice Department, which oversees the DEA, is responsible for the behavior of the DEA. So they introduced this licensing process, and then they sat on it up until 2021. And there's a lot of reality behind that. But the truth is that a lot of those applications just got shuffled directly to Jeff Sessions, at the time was the Attorney General, his desk, and they sat there. And once changes happened within Justice to move the AG aside and move new administrators in, the licenses that had been sitting there were effectively granted in 2021. And so now we have this kind of federal system that allows for the bulk production of cannabis purely for research purposes. And then kind of the stepping stones around how do we migrate the existing state medical, state recreational markets into something that's more of a national framework. And that's where you see this schedule change to Schedule III being the first step of that. To really quickly walk through how that process works, it's quite straightforward. Really, the president requested a review, and that review is responsibility of Secretary Javier Becerra at the Health and Human Services Department.
Chris, just to come in, and that was President Biden last year, 2022. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's when he made the initial request. And what happened is the Secretary of HHS then turns around, rallies the troops and ultimately initiates a review internally. The internal review is presented to the secretary. The secretary then determines what recommendation the secretary will make. And this is the part that I think a lot of people may not understand, is that Biden is not involved at this point, and he will not be involved in the rescheduling. That is actually a decision that's made by Merrick Garland, the Attorney General. That said, Merrick Garland is a Joe Biden appointee, President Biden's appointee. So in the end, he's ultimately directing where things are moving, which is, but it's important to understand that if things slow down from right now, which is where the secretary has said will recommend Schedule III, and it being ratified and moved into law and the schedule being changed, it actually has nothing to do with the president's office right now. It's entirely within HHS and the Justice Department. And then once it is moved to Schedule III, what changes is that as a Schedule I substance, it has no medical value. It is just a dangerous substance, effectively.
So Schedule I, yeah? Schedule I means no medical value. Correct.
High potential for abuse. It's, it's just like, it's a dangerous, societal poison is really that category. And by moving to Schedule III, it changes a lot of things. And one of those things is that it classifies it as a medicine. It acknowledges at a federal level that there are medical properties, which means the FDA is now involved. They need to be. So that's where kind of the story, at least, is now kind of like we're right up to date on the story, so to speak, because we don't really know what the FDA fully intends to do around a Schedule III cannabis product. What their opinions are and their perspective is around CBD. They've been very vocal about CBD, hemp-derived CBD in the Farm Bill, and then ultimately synthesized derivatives like Delta-8, HHC, things that are not naturally occurring in the volumes that they're present in products. But they've gone to Congress. They've said, hey, we can't regulate CBD. You need to fund us. We need a department. Now, is this all potentially part of those pieces coalescing into a larger cannabis regulatory department within the FDA? Maybe. And the question really will be, is the dialogue consistently out of this going to be pointing to the traditional drug development paths? Because if they're constantly going to talk about the drug development paths, then basically they're just saying it's Schedule III and everything is business as usual. But if they're not focusing entirely on saying—
Can I just pause you and just double click there? Just so, because the key thing, right, is I think what's going to come from this as well, I'm going to break down into different stakeholders within the industry, where what does it mean for patients, prescribers, industry, researchers, the global world, and then pharma as well. We're going to get into that. But what do you mean there? Because like the typical cannabis user in some ways, and I think a lot of the challenge that I think is kind of coming up in some uncertainty online is that this has been going on for so long. There's that whole conversation around reschedule or deschedule, but you just touched on a very important point there, that it'll be business as usual if we go down the drug discovery path. Can you just expand on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, at the core, right, even right now, so say we get ratification and ratification may not even be the right word. This is like rescheduling. It's like moving it from one box to another in terms of the administrative documents. But if we get that change to happen, it becomes Schedule III. Still, technically, the only legal products that are being produced are those produced by the DEA bulk manufacturer permit holders. Technically, the Schedule III controlled substance that's being produced by growers all across America, medical or recreational, is not technically legal because it's not an approved medicine as a Schedule III. It doesn't have an indication. It doesn't, it basically, what it does for all intents and purposes with Schedule III is it makes it cannabis an API. Like it all of a sudden says, okay, this has some kind of medical property. You got to figure out what it is. But until you've gone through the development process, you found an indication, you have market access, you have all the pieces that fall into place, cannabis is a medical API and we don't have a specific target. That's
so active pharmaceutical ingredient. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so now cannabis has been an API for a very long time. It's just with a Schedule III, it becomes a far less complicated process to be somebody who's developing these products. You're not talking about the same level of clearances with the DEA for Schedule III to produce it even, right? This is the most interesting part, I think, and this is the part that is not clear at all, and I don't know if it will be clear, is what does this actually do to the DEA permit issuance process? Because if the DEA is issuing permits to produce a controlled or Schedule I controlled substance, and then all of a sudden that substance goes to Schedule III, and technically the oversight of a Schedule III product should flow through the FDA in some capacity. I'm unclear at this point of how the administration reconciles those things. But what I will say is that these are things that are top of mind for what ultimately we work on. But the thing that just general message to anybody who's operating in cannabis is trying to figure out kind of these pieces is like those unknown spots are the biggest opportunities. Because if companies and if trade associations and organizations can coordinate what they're going to suggest, what they're going to recommend around how this rolls out, then in those points of uncertainty, the government is happy to receive ideas. And so in the end, there is an opportunity to try and kind of shape the direction that goes. But I really am not clear. And to some extent, there's a bit of a realization as I'm talking to you right now. Once these permits are no longer for a Schedule I substance, how much does the DEA really need to be involved anymore in that permitting process?
I think the key point, and this is why I'm happy we're talking, is because if we have a look, and I'm going to try to find it and drop it below, but you're transparent and honest that there's still a lot of uncertainty, even though someone like yourself with so much knowledge around this issue, there's so many pathways that it can go. And one of those big factors, right, is because there is so much at play. There is so much at play in terms of the total value of what cannabis production looks like in America now. And Schedule III will mean, hey, but at some point in time, you'll be able to go pick up your cannabis at Walgreens. But it's like, what sort of product will that be, and how will that differ to what's collected now in a dispensary, particularly being mindful that at a state level, where all the revenue that's coming from cannabis and going into each state, they're not going to want to reduce that revenue, are they? They're not going to want to reduce that taxable revenue. And a lot of that, I think it's 70% of that is flower. And so that's going to kind of get us to then start looking at, because I'm mindful of your time, it is, if we didn't break it down, if we're looking at the patient experience, so what do you think patients can expect in America in terms of changes to Schedule III? What do you see happening?
So one thing that is kind of like a build on a change that happened with the Marijuana Research Act that was passed, a few months ago, that didn't really seem all that relevant to most people, but I actually personally think it had some of the most relevant things in it. One of them being that is now legal, or from that point on was legal, for doctors to talk to their patients about cannabis. The reason that's significant is that technically within the Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement schedule, very long document, wouldn't recommend reading to anybody, but within it, there's been clarification provided by Centers for Medicare Services that say that there are fee codes for consulting on cannabis as a physician under that program. So between the legality being implemented on the Cannabis Research Act, or Marijuana Research Act, and the change to Schedule III, with the consideration that, hey, CMMS actually is willing to reimburse this medical service for physicians, You have a situation where doctors now can comfortably prescribe cannabis, which has a medical,
Yes.
acknowledgement at a federal level. Now, how that rolls out in terms of what products they'll be purchasing and where
Sure.
they'd be getting them, that's TBD. But the actual medical experience, what this does is it says, we see you, medical patients. This is a medical
Yes.
product. And it is effectively a federal acknowledgement that this is a medical substance. It doesn't, Schedule III is really a medical category. So it doesn't denote any acknowledgement or recreational consumption of the product. But what it does is it gives it the designation of a medicine or a substance with medical properties. And combined with other actions around medical access and physician prescribing, it allows for a much more seamless system. And that system really is, the way that it's laid out, can very, very smoothly dovetail with state medical systems as well. So you could see a national medical system rolling out across the top of this if they figure out what the product dispensing approach, what the best way to do that is.
Yeah.
The piece I'll say on top of that, and this is like one of many directions that companies may choose to explore, and this is really why I say the uncertainty is really around what directions companies choose to take in terms of opportunities, because there are genuinely so many.
100%. Before we get to that, can I double click on something? Yeah, because at times I think if you're in Australia, you're in the UK, you're down in Latam, South Africa, or other parts of the world in Europe, it's like America's just over here doing their thing. America isn't really that significant. And I'm not saying everyone thinks that. My whole take is that America is going to lead the way in terms of cannabis in healthcare. And I don't know if I'm getting this right, but I'm connecting the dots while you're speaking. And with the power that America is and the size and the innovation that occurs from America, if we're recognizing this as a medicine, right? And for the first time in recent history that we're having this shift, what implications then is that going to have in terms of cannabis regulation in terms of the rest of the world, do you think? Because I don't see that this issue, as I said, people could be like, it's America, it doesn't matter for patients here. But I'm curious, if America goes down this pathway, what implications does it have? And I know we've jumped around, but I think it's interesting because there's going to be people listening from other parts of the world. What implications can or may this have? What are your predictions on what occurs in terms of a flow-on effect in different jurisdictions?
No, it's a good question. It's and it's something I think you and I have talked about previously, is that with cannabis, like even up to this point, unlike anything else when it comes to healthcare generally around the world, the FDA is usually the tip of the pyramid and everybody is looking towards the FDA. All this to say that people look to the US, the FDA generally, as kind of this, a guidepost for it. And where we're at right now is that actually the rest of the world has kind of figured out cannabis in advance.
In some ways.
In some ways, for sure. And everybody's got kind of a Frankenstein version, a different approach to how they're going to do it. And the reality is like cannabis is it's an arid crop. It's going to do best in arid regions around the world. It is perfectly suited as a commodity, economically, geopolitically, comparable to like coffee. Something that is high cost, effort filled, has a quality spectrum attached to it, and is ultimately commoditized and distributed around the world. And the value adds and the processing are done in the regions of those countries, whether it's pressing it, manufacturing, or otherwise. So what I would say is, as far as the shift, where it's particularly relevant to consider, and this again, it's not clear what the US has not signaled what they intend to do here. Where it's relevant is on the single convention, because now the United States is now no longer in agreement with the position that they've agreed to in the single convention. Meaning that, and this is this is a little bit granular, but to understand scheduling, it's really important to understand that the controlled substances schedule at the UN is not the same as a controlled substances schedule in the United States or in Canada. So Schedule I controlled substances this was blown out of proportion when people misunderstood what a Schedule IV was at the UN level. Basically, there's 3 schedules technically at the UN. Cannabis is Schedule I. But for a very long time, cannabis was Schedule I plus 4. 4 is not a full schedule. 4 is like an asterisk that you put beside a dangerous substance to say it's extra dangerous. So the change that happened during the Biden administration around scheduling is that the US voted to remove the 4 part. Okay. It's still Schedule I at the UN level. Well, the United States is now deciding that they're no longer seeing it as a Schedule I, they're seeing it as a Schedule III. And because of the geopolitical force that is in the United States, if they choose to try and push this into the UN conversation, I don't think anybody's objecting. And so
Which
that
means
you could see it rescheduled to Schedule III as a medical substance. It really ultimately changes, like the way that the single convention is structured is it's really a pact around enforcement. So when you sign on to it, you're not agreeing to any specific terms that the UN has dictated. You're just saying, we agree that this list of substances on all these different schedules needs some level of control. In our country, we'll implement our own control framework. And so that's what the controlled schedule is in every country that has one. And it's a reflection of that agreement. But if you're saying domestically, this is not something that we believe needs to be controlled that aggressively, then it is a conversation to be having internationally as well.
Sure.
And that ultimately, I'm in agreement with you that this is the diminishment of like the grip from the United States is significant, because you have to put it in the actual longitudinal context. The grip that every country put on cannabis was pushed by the United States in the first place.
Yep.
All the war on drugs, drug policy, all the repression of, drug production, all that kind of stuff was part of 1960s American foreign policy. So they're saying we don't need it anymore. It gives a lot of permission for other folks to start moving that way too.
And this is a conversation that we could go way down a certain hole, right? But is this also a shift from it being DEA, where it is all about enforcement, right, to then bringing it into healthcare under HHS, where it's then under NIH and FDA? Okay.
Like the reason why I say that is like, and this is like, it's just something to kind of consider is like, generally speaking, law enforcement organizations don't necessarily like giving up, different areas of remit or different areas of enforcement. Like it's not, and so it's very likely that like every person in the DEA that is enforced around this stuff has consumed, tried, or passively been exposed to cannabis in their lives. It's not like, but they're enforcing around this stuff. And so I don't know if there would be any resistance, to be honest with you. I think it's going to really be something that is dictated from like a top-down perspective.
Yep.
Because at the end of the day, the trafficking of cannabis is into the United States is not the same problem it was 10 years ago, because there's no real market for low-grade trafficked product into the United States. There's too many places. Like the trafficking in the United States is domestic. There's plenty of that.
Yes.
Like a lot of the overtaxed, overburdened states are dumping product all over the place. Go to New York, you can see, it's like all the United States importation combined in that city, because, the challenges they're having in terms of enforcement and rolling things out. So that's
probably a good time to segue, right? And if we're going to recap what it looks like for patients, if it goes to Schedule III, it's likely that they will be able to get a prescription from their doctor, right? So how that looks and what that looks like and where they collect it, potentially it's some sort of formulations, whether it's going down which products will pass clinical trial pathways and then be available in something like Walgreens, or it'll then be still available at a state level. So prescribers will be able to prescribe, which is a huge benefit for getting cannabis in healthcare and to be able to utilize this as a first-line therapy. Maybe I'm overreaching there, but we can drill into that afterwards.
It means certainly that there's no real limitations from like a systemic perspective for physicians to take that approach,
which is a major plus. Now to drill into where a lot of the talk is online is that in America, we've got the MSOs, the multi-state operators, right? And so what's been happening, Schedule I at a federal level, but anyone that goes to America in certain states, the adult rec states that you go to, you can go pick up whatever you want. And again, predominantly, there's a lot of the flower, but also with what happens at a state level, there's huge problems at times around the reporting and the quality about what goes on. And so there's two key issues that I would like you to kind of go into is that what does this mean for MSOs? What does it mean at a state level? And then talk in a few minutes about 280E and the significance of that for individuals.
Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest significance for MSOs is 280. Like that really, and so getting into the granularity there, 280E is essentially, it's a law that's really focused primarily around limiting and controlling organized crime. And so it's not specific to cannabis. I think a lot of the misinterpretation is that it's a law that stops cannabis from being, able to be an industry, because it means that you can't expense things. It really is. It's a law that exists as a bit of a trap. It's basically, like if you're able to investigate a big RICO, a racketeering and embezzlement, like a big large case, and you can find that some of the people that are participating in this have actually submitted expenses to the IRS while committing a crime, and it's around, say, controlled substances like drug trafficking, then it allows you to just pin them immediately with that specific violation. And it typically is used in concert with other things, but it's focused on Schedule 1 and 2 substances. So Schedule 3, there's no prohibition from the taxation perspective, even if you're technically producing it illicitly, to submit what are considered to be, and this is where I might get this wrong because it's like I'm not a tax code expert, but I can certainly kind of articulate high level my understanding of it, is that what it does allow for is it allows for the submission of expenses from these businesses that are incurred through the regular process of sale of goods. So what that means is basically it's an operating expense cost.
Okay.
And I think that is significant. Certainly a lot of these companies have major operating expenses that they are essentially holding. There's been plenty of charts that show how profitable MSOs could be if they could remit their taxes or their expenses, right? Where it's not permitted is, and it ultimately isn't really permitted in general, is for around capital expenses. So you couldn't turn around and say, I bought this plane for my company and I'm going to remit the cost of that.
Although some of them would like to, right?
Now that said, if your company is a distribution company and you're filling that plane with boxes of cannabis, you may actually be able to say that's a cost of the goods sold because we sell distribution or what have you. But in that circumstance, you're not technically plant touching, you're plant moving. So either way, what it means is that there could be a significant bill coming to the IRS. Like that's basically a bunch of reimbursement. The thing that I'm not clear on, and I'm curious to see what happens, and this is probably a very active conversation within most finance departments of companies that have been, producing cannabis in the United States, is how far back do you go with deferred expenses? Right? Because if you can get, like, if the IRS is willing to entertain that you can defer your expenses back to whenever you started incurring them, there could be tens of millions of dollars flowing into these companies very, very quickly, which is exciting for the industry, which has been quite in the doldrums lately because everybody's like trying to figure out where it's going to go. So I think that's one big piece is on the MSO side.
That's interesting. Can I just double click on one other point?
Please do.
Just in terms of that, and one of the points is if it goes to Schedule 3, one of the other, I guess, strangleholds on the industry has been payments, right? And been banking. And this isn't only applicable in America, it's applicable in Australia. I've got many friends that have had, been operating clinics and it's telehealth, seeing patients all under prescription, and they had bank accounts frozen. Now, if this goes to a Schedule 3, what implications will that have, again, not only in America, but potentially banking around the world?
So this is where we get into some of the uniqueness of the United States, which is ultimately how litigious it is. How many lawsuits get fired everywhere for everything. And why that's significant here is that, like, if you don't see, the credit card processors come around and say, well, this is not in that category, it's over here. And you can point to examples where they allow people to transact with Schedule 3 controlled substances, then you can sue them, right? Like there's a denial of service involved in there in terms of like, and I look at that and I think, like, there's a lot of things. Like if I'm an MSO and I'm looking at this from a risk perspective, like if I'm being honest with you, so there's two pieces. I don't see a huge shift operationally or, market-wise for MSOs on the recreational piece as it stands right now. The MSOs that have maintained some push or some positioning as medical providers have a huge potential of opportunity. That said,
does that include cross-border
No.
Cross state, no. Okay.
I
Sorry.
mean, cross state maybe, but that'll be that. Like that's where we get into the weeds of like, what did the states decide to do in response to this? Are they going to modify any of their rules? Because some of the states literally are use the language of Schedule I controlled substance in their state acts around
Sure.
cannabis. So there will be changes in some places that need to happen. The real question I have is that up until this point, as an American citizen, you really didn't have any recourse for a product, a cannabis product that was maybe inaccurately labeled, was not formulated properly, that caused you to have an adverse event, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
In terms of basically, as a medical or recreational cannabis user in the United States, there's very little to no path for you to exercise grievances from the legal system. Now there is.
Okay.
And so I would, if I was an MSO, I'd be looking at it saying like, I want to make sure that we have everything buttoned down. Let's double check everything, dial up our standards, add extra warnings,
Great.
be really, really diligent, because now it's a real product. It's not part of the like, you know, the like people try your own risk category of products.
And it's also then comes to duty of care dispensary, right? No longer, hey, have the double edible. At the moment, it's like, okay, what does dosing look like and what does patient information look like?
Yeah. And that becomes a whole other conversation as well.
Yep. To finish up, one of the points that's going online is this is just about big pharma coming in. Can you speak to what are your thoughts on that? Like, what is the relevance of this model for pharmaceutical companies and what does this mean?
So I think it's like a logical assumption, because it's staying, like, at least the announcement to this point is staying within kind of traditional regulatory and you know, law enforcement language. What I would say is like big pharma's had 30 plus years to try and make a drug work out of cannabis. This isn't like as much as it looks like the barriers are coming down, like all the barriers that existed to Schedule I research on cannabis, like the pharma companies never had those. They had all the licenses, they had all the approvals, they could and have, you know, GW as an example, pursued cannabis as a pharmaceutical for decades. It's not new. The reality is that cannabis itself is not particularly well suited for the drug development process which we have and use in the Western world. It's a mirror between Canada, the European Medicines Association, the United States, the FDA, the ARTG in Australia, or TGA in Australia, rather. Like all these regulators take the same approach, and some of them, you know, are firmer than others. And it is a rigorous kind of, you know, marching down a path approach. But my view has always been that cannabis is not suited for that approach. That approach is a single molecule drug discovery channel. And when everybody's like, well, that's how we approve drugs. It's how we need to look at them to ensure that the rigor's there, ensure that there's enough oversight, that there's peer review, that all these things. And then you turn around and then in the last 10 years, they've introduced a totally separate channel for biologics. So there is like, if I'm looking at like this and looking at big pharma in the broader context, like no, like they're printing like thousands of times more money making biologic products that they've introduced through a new channel. Cannabis can't get access to that for some reason. Hopefully this rescheduling, the FDA being involved, actually gets them into a position where they can introduce a bit of an outside the box approach. But pharma doesn't care. Pharma is the multiples on this are not nearly high enough. And I'm sure that they've all done tons and tons of like, and it's also the patent. Like they don't really know how to approach it if there isn't a monopoly lock to it, because it doesn't work with their financial modeling, the investment that goes into it, all those things. So they don't, it's like I'm going to invest $100 million in this trial or $300 or $500 million in the trial. When large pharma companies do that, they do it by buying a drug from a small company that is already, you know, shown all the success. And then they forecast out before they buy that company, they forecast how much money they can make based on how many sick people there are with that condition. And then they say, okay, yeah, we'll buy you for this much because we know we can sell this many pills or this many injections. And there's this many people in the world. that have the condition that you have. Oh, and also this is parallel enough that we can then push a marketing, off-label prescribing, and increase the patient use base by X amount. With cannabis, it doesn't work because there's nobody, like, there isn't people that are punching out from random pharmaceuticals in your neighborhood for you to buy, for, $10 or less a gram. Whereas with cannabis, it is.
Yeah.
So again, it's like the economics of it don't fit how they do business. And so I'm just not, like, I've never been convinced. I think it's interesting. I think that they're absolutely watching the cannabis industry, but at the end of the day, it's a totally different model for, profitability and success and all those things.
Awesome, man. So much more that we could go into, and maybe we do another one when we get some more information. But before we close up, where can people find out more about you? What's coming up for you? We've got a minute to go. Just, where can people, what do you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me. You can find me on LinkedIn, Chris Murray. I'm sure Chad can throw some links up. Our website's FoxNrth.com. There's no O in North, so it's FoxNrth.com. You can, send us an email at FoxNrth.com. I'm Chris at FoxNrth. Feel free. And generally speaking, like, what we're doing with some of our clients right now is we're just kind of working through what the strategic map looks like for opportunities in Schedule III. We didn't go into a ton of that, but you mentioned briefly the over-the-counter path, which does actually open up if you've kind of positioned things right.
Yeah.
The other thing that we didn't really totally touch on is something that, again, is another opportunity, is the FDA has been pretty clear that if you are producing at least hemp-based products that may contain THC or not, that you should be pursuing the botanical, supplements or botanical drug development standards in terms of how you're growing your product. Well, Schedule III product, we have a lot of products out there that are botanically derived, that are in capsules. Licensed natural health products are also a big opportunity. So this kind of pushes us more in that direction. And these are certainly avenues that we're working with folks to explore too.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. We'll drop links below. Thanks for your time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Bye-bye.